London, 1837. Dear listeners, gather close for a tale that will make your hearts race and your souls soar. This is the story of a love so scandalous, so impossible, that it shook the very foundations of English society. Picture, if you will, the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair, where fortunes are made and reputations destroyed with a single whispered word, where dukes dance with diamonds of a season, and where a lady's worth is measured not by her character, but by her connections. Now imagine a world where the most powerful man in England would risk everything, his title, his fortune, his very future for a woman's society had cast aside like yesterday's newspaper. This is that story. The story of Mary Pemberton and Alexander Blackwood. The story of how a duke chose love over logic, hope over convention, and a lady with torn shoes over all the polished perfection money could buy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every great love story must begin with heartbreak. And Mary Pemberton's heart had been broken so many times. She'd stopped believing it could ever be whole again. The autumn rain of 1835 drummed mercilessly against the grimy windows of the makeshift schoolhouse in Whitechapel, where Lady Mary Pemberton knelt beside, a small girl whose tiny fingers traced letters on a cracked slate with the devotion of a monk copying sacred scripture. "Very good, little Anne," Mary whispered, her voice gentle as morning mist over the Thames. "Now, shall we try writing your own name?" If you had seen Mary Pemberton that morning, dear listeners, you might have mistaken her for any other charity worker. Her golden hair, once the envy of every debutante in Mayfair, was simply braided and pinned beneath a modest bonnet that had seen better days. Her dress, pale blue muslin mended at the sleeves, spoke of genteel poverty rather than the opulence she'd once known. But, the irony wasn't lost on her. Here she sat, teaching letters to chimney sweeps' daughters and orphans, while London's finest ladies spent their mornings choosing between French silks and Italian lace for that evening's entertainment. "Miss Mary," whispered young Tommy, tugging at her worn skirt with fingers still stained from his morning work, "why don't you come to the fancy balls no more?" The question struck like ice water through her carefully maintained composure. From the mouths of babes come the cruelest truths. "Because, dear Tommy," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her storm-gray eyes, "sometimes the most important dancing happens in places where there are no ballrooms at all." But the truth, dear listeners, was far more bitter than any child should know. Mary Pemberton, daughter of the late Earl of Ashford, had been effectively banished from polite society. Not through any scandal of her own making, mind you, but by the spectacular financial ruin her mother had brought upon their family name. Lady Catherine Pemberton, God rest her imprudent soul, had possessed an unfortunate talent for gambling away fortunes at the card tables of London's most exclusive gaming hells. By the time consumption claimed her life 2 winters past, she'd left behind debts that could have purchased a small country and a reputation, so tattered it dragged her innocent daughter down with it. The whispers followed Mary everywhere, like shadows that grew longer with each passing day. Poor thing, but really, who would marry into such disgrace? They say she hasn't a penny to her name. The Pembertons were once somebody, but that was before. Well, before the mother's little indiscretions, Mary had learned to wear their pity like armor, but armor, she discovered, could grow quite heavy when worn day after day, year after year. Miss Pemberton, the deep voice, rich as aged brandy and twice as intoxicating, made every child in the room look up from their slates like flowers turning toward the sun. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure filling the doorway, tall, imposing, dressed in the finest black wool that money could buy. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow. Even the street children knew of him, dear listeners. the wealthiest peer in England, owner of coal mines that powered half of London and shipping fleets that connected Britain to the world. A man whose word could topple governments and whose fortune could feed all of London for a year without making a dent in his coffers. And according to the latest gossip sheets that sold faster than hot pies on winter mornings, soon to be engaged to the diamond of the season, Lady Isabella Fairfax. Your Grace! Mary rose gracefully despite the curious flutter in her chest that felt suspiciously like wings trying to escape a cage. You honor us with your presence. His dark eyes, nearly black in the dim light filtering through those grimy windows, surveyed the humble classroom with an unreadable expression. When his gaze fell upon Mary, something flickered there, something that made her pulse quicken against her will. Miss Pemberton? I've heard remarkable things about your charitable endeavors. The way he said charitable made it sound like something far more intriguing than teaching letters to ragamuffins. Knowledge is the greatest gift we can give those who have nothing else. Your Grace, Mary replied, unconsciously lifting her chin with the pride that breeding couldn't quite erase. These children possess minds as sharp as any lord's son given the chance to prove it. Something definitely flickered in those midnight eyes now. Approval? Surprise? Interest? Indeed, he murmured, stepping closer. Close enough that she caught the scent of sandalwood and something distinctly, devastatingly masculine. And what of you, Miss Pemberton? What gifts do you possess that have gone unrecognized? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying candle, heavy with possibilities neither dared name. Before Mary could find her voice to answer, little Anne tugged on the Duke's expensive coat with the fearless audacity that only children possess. Your Grace, sir, she piped up proudly, Miss Mary taught me to write my name. Look. She held up her slate with the enthusiasm of a general displaying a conquered territory, showing crook letters that spelled Anne Brown in chalk. And then, dear listeners, something magical happened. The Duke of Ravenshollow, this man who commanded respect from kings and emperors, knelt down in his pristine clothes, bringing himself to the child's eye level with a gentleness that made Mary's heart perform the most inappropriate acrobatics. Magnificent, Miss Anne, he said with such sincerity that the little girl beamed like the sun itself. Tell me, what would you like to write next? I want to write a letter to my mama in heaven, Anne whispered with the matter-of-fact acceptance children have for life's cruelties. Miss Mary says that if we write with our hearts, the angels can read our words. Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks like a schoolgirl caught in mischief. She had never intended for such fanciful notions to reach ducal ears. But when Alexander Blackwood looked up at her from where he knelt among the children, his expression held something she hadn't seen in a gentleman's face for 2 long, lonely years. Respect. Your teacher, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note that made something deep in Mary's chest unfurl like a flower greeting dawn, is quite extraordinary. And in that moment, dear listeners, though neither Mary nor Alexander knew it yet, their fates became as intertwined as the ivy that climbed the walls of ancient castles. Love, you see, doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it whispers its arrival in the voice of a child, in the kindness shown to the forgotten, in the moment when 2 souls recognize something precious in each other. But Mary Pemberton had been disappointed too many times to trust in whispers, and Alexander Blackwood had responsibilities that seemed to leave no room for extraordinary ladies with torn shoes and impossible dreams. What neither of them realized was that the most powerful force in the universe cares nothing for social conventions or practical considerations. Love, as they were about to discover, makes its own rules. 3 days passed before Mary saw the Duke again. 3 days during which she told herself firmly that his visit had been mere curiosity, nothing more. Dukes, after all, did not concern themselves with charity teachers, no matter how extraordinary their students might be. She was reading to the children from a tattered copy of Fairy Tales Ironic, considering how little she believed in happy endings anymore, when the door opened with enough authority to make the very walls take notice. This time, Alexander wasn't alone. Behind him came a procession that would have been impressive in Mayfair, 2 footmen in pristine livery, a secretary with sharp eyes and a sharper quill, and what appeared to be half of London's gossip columnists trailing in his wake like hungry pigeons following a farmer with grain. Miss Pemberton, the Duke's voice carried easily over the sudden excited chatter of her students. Might I have a word? Mary's heart performed that rebellious dance again, but she kept her voice steady. Children, please continue with your reading. I shall return momentarily. He led her to the small garden behind the school, really just a patch of struggling grass and a single oak tree that had somehow survived the soot and grime of London, but private enough for whatever conversation had brought him here with such fanfare. Miss Pemberton, he began without preamble, and Mary noticed details she missed before. The way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some long-ago adventure, the manner in which he moved through the world as if it had been created specifically for his convenience. I have a proposal for you. Mary's heart stopped, then began beating so quickly she felt dizzy. Surely he didn't mean surely a duke wouldn't. A business proposal, he clarified, though something in his tone suggested the clarification might not be entirely accurate. I see. She kept her voice level, though disappointment tasted surprisingly bitter on her tongue. I wish to establish a series of schools throughout London, Alexander continued, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Places where children of all stations might receive proper education. I need someone to oversee these projects, someone who understands both the necessity of learning and the ... unique challenges faced by those whom society has overlooked. Mary stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You wish me to run your schools? I wish you to create them. Design the curriculum, hire the teachers, choose the locations. You would have complete authority and unlimited funding. It was more than she'd ever dreamed, dear listeners. More than she'd dared hope for in her wildest fantasies of redemption and purpose. But why me, Your Grace? Surely there are others, more qualified ladies of better reputation, men with university degrees. Are there? His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made breathing seem like an optional activity. Tell me, Miss Pemberton, how many ladies of quality do you know who would kneel in the mud to help a child trace letters? How many would sacrifice their social standing to teach orphans and street sweepers? The compliment warmed her more than it should have, more than was safe for a woman in her precarious position. There is one condition, he continued, and Mary's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. Of course there was a condition. There was always a condition when something seemed too good to be true. Yes, you would need to be formally recognized in society. These schools will serve all classes of children, including the sons and daughters of peers. Their parents will never accept an educator who has been socially ostracized. Mary's cheeks burned with the shame she'd learned to carry like a cloak. So he knew about her family's disgrace, about the whispers and the closed doors and the invitations that never came. Which means, the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a tone that made her pulse race like a thoroughbred at Ascot, you would need to be sponsored by someone of unquestionable reputation. Someone whose support would restore your standing in society. And who might that be, Your Grace? Though she suspected she already knew, hope and terror warring in her chest like angels and demons fighting for her soul. Alexander Blackwood stepped closer, close enough that she could see gold flecks in those midnight eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Me. The single word fell between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge to the entire social order of England. "Your Grace," Mary began, but he held up a hand to stop her protests. "Alexander," he corrected softly, "when we discuss matters of such importance, I think we can dispense with excessive formality." "Alexander," she repeated, and his name felt dangerous on her lips, like speaking an incantation that might change everything. "You cannot possibly understand what you're suggesting. To sponsor me, to be seen supporting someone with my reputation, it would cause the most tremendous scandal. Would it?" He moved closer still, and Mary found herself backed against the old oak tree, its bark rough against her spine. Or would it simply remind London society that true worth has nothing to do with one's parents' mistakes? The gossips would have a field day. They would say, Alexander interrupted, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper, that the Duke of Ravenshollow has finally done something interesting. And then, dear listeners, he did something that would be talked about in drawing rooms across London for months to come. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with a gentleness that made her knees forget their primary function. "Mary," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer, "will you let me give you the chance you deserve?" Looking up into his eyes, Mary felt the last of her defenses crumble like castle walls under siege. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to hope, to dream, to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, happy endings weren't only for fairy tales after all. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alexander. I'll accept your proposal." And though neither of them knew it yet, that single word "yes" would set in motion a chain of events that would scandalize London, challenge the very foundations of English society, and prove that love, real love, acknowledges no boundaries save those we create in our own fearful hearts. But first, dear listeners, Mary Pemberton would have to survive her return to the glittering, treacherous world of the Tun. And Alexander Blackwood would have to prove that his interest in the fallen, daughter of a disgraced family, was exactly what he claimed it to be. Nothing more than business. And if that were true, why did his hand linger on her cheek, as if he never wanted to let her go? 1 week later, the announcement appeared in the London Gazette on a crisp October morning, causing ladies across Mayfair to drop their morning chocolate and gentlemen to choke on their kippers. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow, is pleased to announce his patronage of Miss Mary Pemberton in the establishment of the Ravenshollow Educational Foundation. Miss Pemberton will serve as directress of all educational endeavors under His Grace's auspices. By afternoon, every drawing room in London buzzed with speculation like beehives in spring. The Pemberton girl? But surely he means one of the Yorkshire Pembertons? No, it's definitely Catherine Pemberton's daughter, the one whose mother gambled away their fortune. But why would the Duke involve himself with such a person? Perhaps he feels sorry for her. Or perhaps, suggested Lady Worthington with a meaningful glance over her teacup, there are other considerations at play. The implications hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with possibility and scandal. Meanwhile, in her modest lodgings, Mary stared at the official letter that had arrived with the Duke's seal, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. "Miss Pemberton, your first obligation as directress begins tonight. You are invited to attend the Marchioness of Aldridge's ball, where you will be formally introduced to society as my educational consultant. A gown and appropriate accessories have been provided. I shall collect you at 9 o'clock. Ravenshollow Mary's breath caught as she opened the additional package that had accompanied the letter. Inside lay the most exquisite ball gown she'd ever seen, deep sapphire silk that shimmered like water under moonlight, with delicate silver embroidery that caught the light like captured stars. There were silk slippers to match, long white gloves that felt like whispered promises, and a necklace of sapphires that must have cost more than our family's annual income for the past 3 years combined. Mrs. Whitmore, Mary called weakly to her elderly companion. I believe I'm about to faint. Nonsense, her companion replied briskly, though her own eyes were wide with amazement as she fingered the exquisite silk. You're about to make your debut as a lady of consequence. Now come, we must prepare you properly. 2 hours later, Mary barely recognized the woman staring back at her from their cracked mirror. The gown transformed her from a charity teacher into something approaching a fairy tale princess. The sapphires at her throat made her eyes look like starlight captured in crystal, and her golden hair, dressed high with pearl pins that had appeared as if by magic, gleamed like spun silk in candlelight. You look, Mrs. Whitmore said with satisfaction, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief, like a duchess. A knock at the door made Mary's heart leap into her throat like a bird taking flight. The Duke of Ravenshollow stood on her threshold, resplendent in black evening wear that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the aristocratic lines of his face. When he saw her, something flickered in his expression: surprise, appreciation, and something else that made her pulse race. Miss Pemberton, he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. You are ... breathtaking. Before she could find her voice to respond, he offered his arm with the grace of a man born to command. Shall we go scandalize London? The Marchioness of Aldridge's ballroom glittered like a jewel box brought to life by some master craftsman's dream. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across walls hung with gold silk. Ladies in rainbow-hued gowns waltzed with gentlemen in pristine black and white, while the scent of hothouse flowers mingled with expensive perfumes and the whispered secrets that were the true currency of the ton. Mary felt every eye in the room turn toward them as the Duke led her down the marble steps that swept into the ballroom like a waterfall of wealth and privilege. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow, the butler announced in ringing tones that carried over the music and conversation, and Miss Mary Pemberton. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Is that really the Pemberton girl? She looks positively transformed. Those sapphires must be worth a fortune. Why is he sponsoring her? Do you think they're... Mary lifted her chin and smiled serenely, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The Duke's hand was warm and steady beneath her gloved fingers, an anchor in the storm of speculation swirling around. Them. Remember, he murmured as they approached their hostess, his breath warm against her ear. You are here by right, not by charity. You have as much claim to be in this room as any of them. The Marchioness of Aldridge, a formidable woman with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed. Nothing greeted them with the careful politeness reserved for situations requiring the most delicate navigation. Your Grace, how delightful! And Miss Pemberton, I understand you're to be commended for your educational work. The pause before educational work conveyed volumes about what the Marchioness really thought of such pursuits. Miss Pemberton, the Duke replied smoothly, his voice carrying just enough steel to make it clear he would brook no insults to his protégé, has undertaken the establishment of schools that will serve all of London's children, regardless of their station. It is a project close to my heart. How? Progressive, the Marchioness managed, though her tone suggested she found progress about as appealing as a plague of locusts. As they moved through the ballroom, Mary became acutely aware of the delicate dance of social politics playing out around them. Some guests greeted her warmly, clearly taking their cue from the Duke's obvious approval. Others offered the barest civility, their disapproval wrapped in silk gloves and false smiles. And then there was Lady Isabella Fairfax. The acknowledged diamond of the season approached them with a smile that could have cut glass and enough beauty to make angels weep with envy. She was everything Mary was not, tall where Mary was petite, dark-haired where Mary was fair, elegant in the way that only comes from generations of the finest breeding and unlimited funds. "Alexander," she purred, ignoring Mary entirely as if she were a piece of furniture of no particular interest. "How wonderful to see you. I was just telling Mama that we simply must discuss the arrangements for Isabella." The Duke's voice was polite but notably cool. "Allow me to present Miss Mary Pemberton." "Mary, Lady Isabella Fairfax?" The two women regarded each other with the wary assessment of generals before a battle, each taking the other's measure in a single glance. "Miss Pemberton." Isabella's smile never wavered, though something predatory flickered in her eyes. "I understand you've been working with ... children of the lower classes." "How very charitable of you." The emphasis on charitable made it sound like something slightly shameful, like admitting to an embarrassing disease. "I find," Mary replied evenly, drawing on every lesson in deportment her governess had ever beaten into her, "that children of all classes possess remarkable intelligence when given the opportunity to develop it. Perhaps you might visit one of our schools sometime, Lady Isabella. I believe you'd be quite surprised by what you'd learn." Isabella's perfect composure slipped slightly, like a mask shifting to reveal the face beneath. "How kind of you to suggest it." Before the conversation could deteriorate into the kind of subtle warfare that could destroy reputations with a perfectly placed barb, the Duke intervened. "Mary, I believe the next waltz is beginning. Would you do me the honor?" Mary's breath caught in her throat. To waltz with the Duke of Ravenshollow in front of all of London society would be to announce her complete restoration to respectability, or it would be seen as something else entirely. "I would be delighted," she replied, placing her hand in his with a grace that would have made her long-dead mother proud. As they moved onto the dance floor, Mary was acutely aware of every eye in the room following their progress like stargazers tracking a comet. The Duke's hand was warm at her waist, his fingers sure and strong as he led her through the steps with the kind of effortless elegance that spoke of the finest dancing masters money could buy. "You're trembling," he observed quietly, spinning her expertly through a turn that made her skirts flare like blue silk clouds. "I'm terrified," she admitted, her honesty surprising them both. "What are people thinking?" "They're thinking," he replied, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made the rest of the ballroom fade away like morning mist, "that you're the most beautiful woman in the room." Mary looked up at him in surprise, and found herself drowning in those midnight depths. "Your Grace, Alexander," he corrected softly. "When we're dancing like this, when you're in my arms, call me Alexander." "We're hardly alone," Mary protested, though her voice came out breathier than she intended. "Aren't we?" His hand tightened slightly at her waist, sending warmth spiraling through her in ways that were decidedly improper. "I find that with the right partner, a crowded ballroom can become the most private place in the world." The waltz ended far too soon, leaving Mary feeling bereft as he escorted her from the dance floor. But as they moved toward the terrace doors for some much-needed air, a figure stepped into their path that made Mary's blood turn to ice in her veins. Lord Reginald Hartley, her mother's former lover, the man who had encouraged Lady Catherine's gambling habits and then disappeared like smoke when the debts came due, leaving behind nothing but ruin and heartbreak. He was staring at Mary with an expression of malicious calculation that made her skin crawl like insects were marching across her flesh. "Miss Pemberton," he drawled, his voice like oil poured over broken glass. "How delightful to see you found ... patronage. Your dear mother would be so proud." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to wound. Mary felt Alexander stiffen beside her, his hand moving protectively to the small of her back. "Hartley," the Duke's voice was deadly quiet, carrying a warning that would have made wiser men retreat. "You will excuse us." "Of course, Your Grace, though I do hope Miss Pemberton and I will have a chance to discuss old times. There's so much I could tell you about her family single quotes s ... history." The threat was as clear as crystal, hanging in the perfumed air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Mary felt the blood drain from her face, but before either she or Alexander could respond, Lord Hartley melted back into the crowd, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive tobacco and malice. "Mary?" Alexander's voice was gentle now, concerned. "What was that about?" She looked up at him, this powerful, honorable man who had shown her such kindness, and knew, with crystal clarity, that she could never tell him the whole truth about her mother's sins. How could she explain that there were letters, terrible letters, that could destroy not only her reputation, but his as well? How could she admit that her mother had done more than just lose money at Hartley's card tables? Nothing of importance, she lied, and hated herself for it. Merely old gossip, long since dead and buried. But as they finally escaped to the moonlit terrace, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that Lord Hartley's reappearance was going to change everything. And not for the better. Some secrets, she was beginning to realize, refused to stay buried. And when they claw their way back to the surface, they tend to destroy everything in their path. The terrace of Aldrich House stretched like a marble stage beneath the October stars, with Chinese lanterns swaying gently in the evening breeze and casting pools of colored light across the stone balustrade. It should have been romantic, dear listeners. It should have been the perfect setting for the kind of tender conversation that leads to declarations of love. Instead, Mary stood gripping the marble railing so tightly her knuckles showed white through her gloves, trying to calm the storm of panic raging in her chest. "Tell me about Hartley," Alexander said quietly, coming to stand beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Mary kept her eyes fixed on the darkened gardens below, afraid that if she looked at him, he would see the truth written across her face like words on a page. "There's nothing to tell." "Mary," his voice was gentle but firm, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "The man just threatened you in front of half of London society. There's clearly something to tell." How could she explain? How could she tell this honorable man that Lord Hartley had been her mother's lover? That he had encouraged Lady Catherine's gambling addiction, supplied her with credit at the most exclusive gaming hells, and then vanished like smoke when the creditors came calling? How could she admit that there were rumors, terrible whispered rumors, that her mother had done more than just lose money at Hartley's card tables? "He knew my mother," Mary said finally, the words feeling like gravel in her throat. "They moved in the same circles." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. And the whole truth was what had the power to destroy them both. Alexander studied her profile in the lamplight, his dark eyes seeing too much. And he holds me responsible for my family's debts. This, at least, was true. Some people believe that scandal is hereditary, like the color of one's eyes or the shape of one's nose. Do you think I'm some people, Mary? The question made her turn to face him, and what she saw in his expression nearly broke her resolve. In the gentle light of the Chinese lanterns, His features seemed carved from marble by a master sculptor, classical, beautiful, but touched with something entirely human in the depths of his dark eyes. "No," she whispered, "but perhaps you should be." Before he could respond to that cryptic statement, footsteps approached across the terrace with the sharp click of expensive heels on marble. Lady Isabella emerged from the ballroom like a vision in rose silk, her gown rustling against the stone floor with the whispered promise of wealth and privilege. "Alexander, there you are," she said, her voice carrying just enough breathlessness to suggest she'd been searching everywhere for him. "Mama is looking for you something about tomorrow night's dinner party." Isabella's gaze flicked to Mary with barely concealed irritation. "Miss Pemberton, you look rather pale. Perhaps the evening air is too much for you?" The dismissal was clear as crystal, but Mary had not survived 2 years of social ostracism without learning to hold her ground. "Actually, I find the fresh air quite restorative," she replied with perfect composure. "London ballrooms can be rather suffocating, don't you find?" Indeed, Isabella's smile could have frozen champagne mid-pour. "Though I suppose it depends on what one is accustomed to." The barb hit its mark, but before Mary could respond, Alexander stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that made strong men step aside. "Isabella, I believe your mother can wait a few moments longer. Miss Pemberton and I were discussing the curriculum for the new schools." "Oh yes, the schools." Isabella waved a dismissive hand decorated with rings worth more than most families earned in a lifetime. "How very worthy of you both. Though I do wonder if such projects are quite suitable for a lady of quality." "Are you suggesting," Mary asked with deceptive quiet, "that education is unsuitable for ladies?" "I'm suggesting that some pursuits are more appropriate than others. A lady's sphere is her home and family, not teaching street urchins to read." "And yet," Alexander interjected, his voice carrying a new edge that would have warned a wiser woman to retreat, "some of history's most remarkable women have been educators. Catherine the Great established schools throughout Russia. Maria Theresa founded universities across Austria. Even our own Queen Elizabeth received the finest education available." Isabella's perfect composure slipped like a mask dropping to reveal the person beneath. "That's rather different, is it?" Mary asked, warming to the debate despite her earlier discomfort. "Or are we simply told it's different because acknowledging women's intellectual capabilities threatens the established order?" "Miss Pemberton," Isabella's voice dropped to a tone that could have cut diamonds, "I hardly think you're qualified to speak about established orders, given your circumstances." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge, and Mary felt the familiar shame rise in her chest like floodwater. But before she could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Isabella?" The single word carried such cold authority that the other woman actually took a step backward. "You will apologize to Miss Pemberton? Immediately." "Alexander, surely you don't mean—" "Apologize," he repeated, and something in his tone made it clear. This was not a request but a command from a man who owned half of England and wasn't accustomed to being disobeyed. For a moment, dear listeners, it seemed as though Isabella might actually comply. Her face went white, then red, as the implications of the scene played out in her mind. Then her expression hardened with something approaching hatred. "I see," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the evening air. "How very illuminating this evening has been." She turned and swept back into the ballroom with the kind of dramatic exit that would have done credit to the finest actresses at Drury Lane. The silence that followed seemed to echo with unspoken implications. Alexander, Mary began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Don't apologize for her behavior, he said firmly. And don't you dare apologize for defending yourself. But I've made an enemy of the woman everyone expects you to marry. The words slipped out before Mary could stop them, and she immediately wished she could call them back. Alexander turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the shifting light of the lanterns. Is that what everyone expects? Mary's throat felt dry as sawdust. Isn't it what you expect? For a long moment, he didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither seemed willing to ask and truths neither seemed ready to hear. Finally, Alexander moved closer, close enough that Mary could see the reflection of the lantern light in his dark eyes, close enough that she could count his heartbeats if she dared place her hand on his chest. Mary, he said quietly, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. What I expect and what I want are beginning to prove very different things. Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped back, his expression returning to the polite mask of a perfect gentleman navigating the treacherous waters of society. I should return you to Mrs. Whitmore, he said, offering his arm with punctilious correctness. It's growing late. But as they made their way back through the ballroom, Mary caught sight of Lord Hartley standing near the card room, watching them with that same calculating expression that had chilled her blood earlier. When their eyes met, he raised his glass in a mocking salute that made her stomach turn with dread. And it was the conversation she overheard near the refreshment table that truly made her blood run cold. Mark my words, there's more to this than charity. The Duke doesn't sponsor fallen women out of the goodness of his heart. Fallen? That's rather harsh, don't you think? Is it? Have you seen how he looks at her? In that dress, those sapphires alone could buy a house in Mayfair. You think they're actually... I think the Duke of Ravenshollow is playing a very dangerous game. And when it comes crashing down, it won't be his reputation that suffers most. Mary's hands clenched involuntarily at her sides. She'd been naive to think that Alexander's sponsorship would simply restore her reputation. Instead, it seemed to have created an entirely new scandal, one that could destroy them both. As their carriage rolled through the London streets toward her lodgings, she studied Alexander's profile and the dim interior light filtering through the windows. Your Grace, she began carefully. Perhaps we should reconsider this arrangement. Which arrangement? His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. The schools, my position as directress. It seems my involvement is causing complications you didn't anticipate. Alexander was quiet for so long that Mary began to think he wouldn't answer. The clip-clop of the horses' hooves on cobblestone, and the distant sounds of London's nightlife filled the silence between them. Then he turned to face her, and in the flickering light from the street lamps, his expression was fierce with an emotion she didn't dare name. Mary, he said quietly, I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me. Following the rules, meeting society's demands, being the perfect duke who never puts a foot wrong. Do you know what that's given me? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Everything I'm supposed to want, and nothing I actually need. His hand moved as if he might reach for hers, then stopped, propriety winning the battle with desire. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something because it's right, not because it's expected. Don't ask me to stop now. The carriage drew to a halt outside her modest lodgings. The contrast between the Duke's elegant equipage and her humble dwelling stark in the lamplight. As Alexander handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers just a moment longer than propriety demanded, sending warmth spiraling up her arm. Mary, he said as she reached her door, turning back to face him, there's something you should know. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. Yes? Tomorrow night, I'm having dinner with Isabella's family. Her father wishes to discuss ... expectations. Mary felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. I see. Do you? His dark eyes held hers across the small distance that separated them. Because I'm not certain I do. Before she could ask what he meant, he bowed with formal correctness and returned to his carriage, leaving Mary standing on her doorstep in her borrowed finery, watching his carriage disappear into the London fog. She stood there long after the sound of wheels on cobblestone had faded, wondering if she'd just witnessed the end of a beautiful dream or the beginning of something far more dangerous than either of them had bargained for. Inside her small parlor, Mrs. Whitmore waited with a cup of tea and worried eyes. How was the ball, dear? Complicated, Mary replied, sinking into their one comfortable chair. Mrs. Whitmore, what would you do if someone offered you everything you'd ever dreamed of, but accepting it might destroy the person offering it? Her elderly companion studied her with the shrewd eyes of someone who had lived long enough to recognize love when she saw it, even when the people experiencing it were too frightened to name it. I suppose, she said carefully, I'd ask myself whether love without courage is really love at all. Mary looked up sharply. Love? Oh, my dear girl, Mrs. Whitmore said gently, settling into the chair across from her. Did you think it was something else? And for the first time since her mother's death, Mary Pemberton began to cry not the careful. Silent tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but the wild, desperate sobs of a woman who had just realized she'd fallen in love with a man she could never have. Because tomorrow night, the Duke of Ravenshollow would dine with the family of the woman everyone expected him to marry. And Mary would have to decide whether she was brave enough to fight for a love that seemed impossible, or wise enough to step aside before she destroyed everything Alexander had worked so hard to build. While Mary sat in her tiny parlor, grading her young students' compositions by the light of a single candle, trying desperately not to think about what was happening in the grand dining room of Lord Fairfax's Mayfair mansion, Alexander Blackwood stood in that very room, feeling like a man preparing for his own execution. The dinner had been everything he'd expected and dreaded in equal measure. Perfectly prepared courses served on china worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. Conversation that flowed as smoothly as the finest wine, touching on all the approved subjects: politics, the weather, the latest fashions from Paris. Lord Fairfax had spoken at length about bloodlines and breeding, about the importance of suitable matches and the benefits of uniting great fortunes. He'd outlined marriage settlements with the precision of a general planning a military campaign, treating his daughter's future happiness as a minor consideration compared to the consolidation of wealth and power. Lady Fairfax had enumerated Isabella's accomplishments with the thoroughness of a horse dealer. Tattersall's her fluency in French and Italian, her skill at watercolors that made grown men weep with their beauty, her perfectly managed household accounts that balanced the penny. Isabella herself had been the picture of docile elegance, speaking only when spoken to, expressing opinions that perfectly mirrored those of the men present, never once showing a spark of the passion or intelligence that might threaten masculine authority. It should have been ideal. It would have been ideal merely a week ago. Now, as Alexander stood listening to Lord Fairfax outline the marriage settlements he envisioned, all he could think of was Mary Pemberton's passionate defense of education for all children, her willingness to kneel in the dirt to help a chimney sweep's daughter trace letters, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of justice and opportunity, and the radical notion that a person's worth had nothing to do with the circumstances of their birth. Naturally, we would expect the announcement to appear in next month's papers. Lord Fairfax was saying, cutting his roast beef with the same precision he applied to business deals. Spring would be ideal for the wedding, don't you think? Just after the season ends, when everyone is still in London to witness. I haven't proposed. Alexander interrupted quietly. The dining room fell silent, except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Lord Fairfax's fork paused halfway to his mouth. I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I said I haven't proposed to your daughter. Therefore, discussions of wedding dates seem somewhat premature. Lady Fairfax's face went white as fine porcelain. Your Grace, surely you're not suggesting, it's been understood for months that you and Isabella have been friends. Alexander finished, his voice calm but implacable. Nothing more has been formally established between us. Isabella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the shocked silence. Alexander, what are you saying? He really looked at her, and saw a woman who would make him a perfectly acceptable duchess. Beautiful, well-bred, accomplished in all the ways society deemed important. A woman who would never challenge him, never argue with him, never force him to examine his assumptions or question his beliefs. A woman who would bore him to tears within a year. I'm saying, he replied as gently as he could manage, that perhaps we've all made assumptions that shouldn't have been made. The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife and served on the Fairfax family china. Your Grace, Lord Fairfax's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone of a man who was not accustomed to having his plans disrupted. Are you withdrawing your interest in my daughter? I'm saying that I need time to consider my future more carefully. Time? Lady Fairfax's voice rose to a near shriek that made the crystal glasses ring in sympathy. Your Grace, you cannot simply toy with a young lady's affections. I have never toyed with anyone's affections. Alexander replied with the kind of steel that had made kings think twice before crossing him. I have been a friend to your daughter, nothing more. If you interpreted friendship as something else, that was your choice, not mine. Isabella's carefully maintained composure finally cracked like ice under pressure. Is this about that woman? That charity case you've been parading around London? Miss Pemberton is not a charity case, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a tone that would have warned wiser people to retreat. She is what? Isabella demanded, tears starting to flow down her perfect cheeks. Though whether from genuine hurt or wounded pride, Alexander couldn't tell. What is she to you? Alexander opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. What was Mary Pemberton to him? A business associate? A friend? Something more dangerous than either? She is someone who has shown me that there are more important things in life than maintaining appearances, he said finally, and the truth of the words surprised him even as he spoke them. Lord Fairfax stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound like fingernails on a blackboard. Your Grace, you're making a grave error. Isabella is everything you could want in a duchess. Isabella is everything I'm supposed to want, Alexander corrected, standing as well. There's a difference. And this Pemberton woman? What can she offer you? A family name tainted by scandal? Debts that would embarrass a merchant? The whispers and speculation that will follow any connection to her? Every word hit like a physical blow, because they were all true. Mary could offer him nothing that would benefit the Duchy of Ravenshollow in any tangible way. Nothing except the way she made him feel when she smiled, the passion in her voice when she spoke of justice, the courage she showed every day facing a world that had rejected her with her dignity intact, the way she challenged him to be better than his circumstances demanded. Perhaps, Alexander said quietly, knowing that what he was about to say would burn every bridge between himself and the Fairfax family. What she offers is exactly what I need. He bowed formally to the shocked family. his movements precise despite the emotion churning in his chest. "I thank you for your hospitality, but I believe this evening has reached its natural conclusion." As he walked through the London streets toward his own mansion, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of a man who had just burned all his bridges and found himself finally able to see the horizon clearly. By morning, the gossip would be all over London. By afternoon, he would be the subject of speculation in every drawing room in Mayfair. And by evening, he would need to decide what he was going to do about Miss Mary Pemberton. Because after tonight, there was no going back. He'd made his choice, even if he hadn't quite admitted it to himself yet. The question now was whether Mary would make the same choice, or whether Lord Hartley's threats would succeed in driving her away before Alexander could find the courage to tell her how he really felt. The following morning dawned gray and drizzling, as if London itself were weeping for the complications love could bring. Mary was teaching her students about geography using a map so old that several countries had changed names since its printing, when the door to the schoolhouse opened with such force that it rattled the windows. But it wasn't the Duke of Ravenshollow who stood in the doorway this time. Lord Reginald Hartley stood there like a poisonous flower in a modest garden, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, his clothes expensive but somehow managing to look tawdry in the morning light. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying the oily smoothness that had once charmed her naive mother, "how delightful to see you again. Might we have a word?" Mary's blood turned to ice in her veins, but she kept her voice steady. "Children, please continue with your map work. I'll return in a moment." She led him to the small garden behind the school, her mind racing. What could Hartley want? And why now, when her association with the Duke was already causing whispers throughout London? "You look well, my dear," Hartley said, his eyes traveling over her modest dress with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Prosperity suits you. That gown you wore at the Aldridge ball was quite illuminating. What do you want, Lord Hartley?" "Straight to the point." "How refreshing." He smiled, and the expression reminded Mary of a snake eyeing a particularly plump mouse. "Your dear mother was much more circuitous in her conversations." The mention of her mother made Mary's hands clench into fists at her sides. "You will not speak of her." "Oh, but I must, you see. Catherine and I had such an intimate relationship. She confided so many things to me. Things that, if they became public knowledge, would destroy what little remains of your family's reputation." From his coat, he withdrew a packet of letters bound with a faded pink ribbon that Mary recognized with a sick lurch of her stomach. Her mother's ribbon, the one she'd worn in her hair on her wedding day. "Love letters," Hartley continued with the casual cruelty of a man who had made a career of destroying lives. "Very passionate love letters. Letters that detail not only our personal relationship, but also certain financial arrangements your mother made to cover her gambling debts." Mary felt the world spin around her as the implications hit home. What kind of arrangements? The kind that involved promises no lady should make. The kind that, if revealed, would prove beyond doubt that Lady Catherine Pemberton was not the victim of circumstance, but a willing participant in activities that would shock even the most liberal members of society. The garden seemed to tilt on its axis. Mary sank onto the small wooden bench beneath the oak tree, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "What do you want?" she whispered. Hartley's smile widened with the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Nothing too onerous, my dear. Simply for you to disappear from London society. Immediately." "What?" end this ridiculous association with the Duke of Ravenshollow. Return to whatever provincial obscurity you crawled out of. In return, these letters will remain my little secret." Mary stared at him, understanding flooding through her like ice water in her veins. "You're afraid. I beg your pardon? You're afraid of what Alexander, what the Duke represents. You're afraid that if a man of his influence takes an interest in me, someone might start investigating my mother's debts more closely. Someone might discover exactly how those debts were incurred, and who encouraged her to incur them." Hartley's urbane mask slipped slightly, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath the polished surface. "You always were too clever for your own good," he said softly, his voice dropping to a tone that made her flesh crawl. "Just like your mother. My mother was destroyed by men like you. Your mother was destroyed by her own weakness. I simply provided opportunities. You provided temptation to a woman struggling with grief and addiction. I provided excitement to a woman bored with her tedious life." His voice hardened like steel, cooling in winter air. "But this conversation is pointless. The terms are simple, Miss Pemberton. Disappear or be destroyed." Mary looked at the packet of letters, knowing they contained enough ammunition to not only ruin her completely, but potentially damage Alexander's reputation as well. Society would never forgive a duke who associated with the daughter of a woman who had sold herself to pay gambling debts. "How long do I have?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "Until tomorrow evening. There's a ship leaving London for the Americas. I've taken the liberty of booking you passage, and if I refuse, then these letters will be delivered to every major newspaper in London. By Sunday, your name and by association, the Dukes will be the subject of the most delicious scandal the ton has seen in years." After Hartley left, Mary sat alone in the tiny garden, staring at the oak tree that had somehow survived the soot and grime of London. Through the window of the schoolhouse, she could see her students bent over their work, their faces bright with the hope that education could lift them from poverty. All of it would be lost if she stayed. The schools, Alexander's reputation, the chance to make a real difference in the world. Through the grimy glass, she could see Alexander's carriage waiting in the street. He had kept his word about giving her time, but now that time had run out in the cruelest possible way. Mrs. Whitmore found her there an hour later, still staring at the tree as if it might hold the answers to all her problems. "Mary, dear, what did that horrible man want?" "He wants me to leave London. Tonight." "Leave? But why?" Mary turned to face her elderly companion, this woman who had stood by her through everything, who deserved to know the truth at last. "Because he has proof that my mother was not the innocent victim we pretended she was." Mrs. Whitmore's face crumpled with understanding. "Oh, my dear girl." "You knew," Mary realized with sudden clarity. "You knew what she'd done to try to pay the debts." "I suspected." Toward the end, she was desperate. And desperate people do desperate things to protect the ones they love. "She did it for me," Mary whispered, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "She compromised herself to protect my future. And now her sacrifice has been for nothing. What are you going to do?" Mary looked toward the street, where Alexander's carriage waited with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. A man who didn't know that in a few hours she would have to break both their hearts to save his honor. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning," she said quietly, standing and smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. "I'm going to tell him the truth, because if she was going to lose him, and there was no escaping that now, she would at least lose him honestly. Some truths she had learned were too important to keep secret, even when telling them destroyed everything you held dear. Alexander was pacing beside his carriage when Mary finally emerged from the schoolhouse, and one look at her pale face told him everything he needed to know about her conversation with Hartley. "What did he threaten you with?" he asked without preamble, abandoning all pretense of polite small talk. Mary looked up at him, this remarkable man who had shown her kindness when the world showed her none, and felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble like ancient walls under siege. "Letters," she said quietly. "Love letters between my mother and him." "I see." Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "And these letters contain information that would be ... damaging. They contain proof that my mother's debts were just from gambling." Mary forced herself to meet his eyes, knowing this might be the last time she would see understanding there instead of disgust. "They contain proof that she sold herself to pay those debts." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence, heavy with the weight of scandal that could destroy them both. Alexander was quiet for so long that Mary began to think he wouldn't respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd expected, warmer than she deserved. "And you believe this reflects on you?" "It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what society will believe. And society will believe that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." "Society?" Alexander said quietly, his dark eyes never leaving her face, "has been wrong about many things." Mary shook her head, tears threatening to spill over despite her best efforts to maintain her composure. "Alexander, you don't understand. If these letters become public, they won't just destroy me. They'll destroy you too. No duke can survive being associated with what? A woman whose mother made desperate choices in desperate circumstances? With a family tainted by prostitution," Mary said bluntly, needing him to understand the full scope of the scandal that would engulf them both. "Because that's what the papers will call it. That's what the ton will whisper behind their fans. And that's what will follow you for the rest of your life." Alexander moved closer, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made breathing seem optional. "Mary, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. "Do you believe you are responsible for your mother's choices?" "No, but do you believe you are less worthy of love because of what she did?" "That's not the question. It's the only question that matters." His hands rose to cup her face gently, his touch warm against her cold skin. "Mary, I've spent my entire life caring about what other people think, doing what was expected, being the perfect duke who never puts a foot wrong. And where has it gotten me? Alexander, 32 years old, surrounded by people who want my title and fortune, with no one who cares about the man beneath the coronet." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "You care about that man. You see him. You argue with him, challenge him, make him want to be better than he is. Do you think I would give that up because some long-dead scandal might make the gossips whisper?" Mary felt tears slide down her cheeks, each one carrying away another piece of the protective wall she'd built around her heart. "You say that now, but when the letters are published, then we'll face it together." "No." Mary stepped back, away from his gentle touch, away from the temptation to believe that love could conquer all. "I won't let you sacrifice everything for me. I won't be responsible for destroying your life the way my mother's choices destroyed ours. Mary, Hartley has booked me passage on a ship to America. It leaves tomorrow evening." Alexander went very still, as if her words had turned him to stone. "And you're planning to take it?" "I'm planning to disappear the way he wants. It's the only way to protect you." "Protect me?" Alexander's voice rose with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. Mary, I don't need protection. I need... What? What do you need? You, he said simply, the word carrying more weight than any declaration of love. I need you. The raw honesty in his voice nearly broke her resolve, nearly made her believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love really could conquer scandal and social ruin. But then reality reasserted itself with cruel clarity. I'm sorry, she whispered, backing toward the schoolhouse door. I'm so sorry, Alexander. But I can't let you throw your life away for me. Before he could respond, she turned and fled back into the building, leaving Alexander standing alone in the London street with his heart breaking and his marriage proposal dying on his lips. Inside the schoolhouse, Mary sank into her chair and wept for her mother's sacrifices, for her own impossible situation, and for the love she was about to lose to save the man she loved more than her own happiness. But sometimes, dear listeners, love refuses to accept defeat gracefully. And Alexander Blackwood had not become one of England's most powerful peers by accepting no for an answer. Alexander Blackwood had not become one of England's most powerful peers by accepting defeat gracefully. As his carriage rolled through the London streets toward his Mayfair mansion, his mind worked with the cold precision that had made him wealthy beyond imagination and feared by his enemies. Hartley had made one crucial error. He had underestimated exactly how far a duke would go to protect the woman he loved. Jameson, Alexander called as he strode into his study, his usual composure replaced by barely controlled urgency. I need you to send messages immediately. His secretary, a thin man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, reached for his pen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate his employer's needs. Yes, Your Grace. First, to my solicitor. Tell him I need every piece of information he can find about Lord Reginald Hartley's financial situation. Debts, investments, properties, everything down to the last penny. Of course, Your Grace. Second, to my banker. I want to know who holds Hartley's markers. If he's gambling in men like Ken always are, someone is extending him credit. Immediately. Your Grace. Third, Alexander's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. To the editors of the London Gazette, the Morning Post, and the Times, tell them the Duke of Ravenshollow has an exclusive story that will be of great interest to their readers. Jameson looked up from his notes, curiosity flickering in his intelligent eyes. May I ask what sort of story, Your Grace? The sort that reminds London society exactly why it's unwise to threaten a duke's interests. While Alexander set his plans in motion with the ruthless efficiency that had built his fortune, Mary spent the longest night of her life packing her few belongings and trying not to think about the life she was leaving behind. Mrs. Whitmore helped in tearful silence, neither woman willing to acknowledge that they were saying goodbye forever. There is something I need to tell you, Mrs. Whitmore said finally, as Mary folded her teaching supplies into a small trunk with hands that shook despite her best efforts to remain steady. What is it? Your mother. She didn't just write letters to Lord Hartley. She kept a journal during those final months. I found it after she died, hidden beneath her mattress. Mary's hands still on the warm book she'd been packing. What kind of journal? The kind that tells the whole truth about what happened, including how Hartley manipulated her, how he deliberately encouraged her addiction, how he threatened her when she tried to stop. Mary turned to stare at her companion with dawning understanding. You've had this for 2 years? I was trying to protect you. But now... Mrs. Whitmore reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and grief. Now I think you need to know what really happened. Mary took the journal with trembling hands. Her mother's handwriting, faded but legible, covered page after page in the careful script she remembered from childhood letters and birthday cards. As she read, her understanding of the past 2 years shifted completely, like a kaleidoscope turning to reveal an entirely new pattern. Her mother hadn't been a willing participant in her own destruction. She'd been a victim systematically manipulated and controlled by a man who had used her grief and vulnerability for his own twisted ends. He says he loves me, but I know better now. He loves what I can give him: money, connections, the thrill of controlling someone who should be beyond his reach. I've tried to stop, tried to walk away, but he threatens Mary's future. Says he'll make sure she never finds a decent husband, never has a chance at happiness. So I continue, God help me, because I would rather damn my own soul than see my daughter suffer for my mistakes. Mrs. Whitmore, Mary said quietly, her voice thick with tears and rage in equal measure, why are you showing me this now? Because that young man loves you, dear. And sometimes love is worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. The next morning brought a surprise that had all of London buzzing with excitement and speculation. The London Gazette featured a front-page story that made Mary drop her morning tea. The cup shattering on the floor in a spray of porcelain and Earl Grey, Duke of Ravenshollow announces engagement to Miss Mary Pemberton. His Grace wishes to announce his betrothal to Miss Mary Pemberton, distinguished educator and philanthropist. The wedding will take place by special license within the fortnight. His Grace states, Miss Pemberton has shown me the true meaning of nobility, not that which comes from birth, but that which comes from character. I am honored beyond measure that she has consented to be my Duchess. Mary stared at the paper in shock, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. He had announced their engagement without her consent, without even speaking to her since yesterday's painful conversation. Before she could fully process what this meant, a knock came at her door. This time, it wasn't Lord Hartley standing on her threshold. It was Alexander, accompanied by a distinguished gentleman she didn't recognize, elderly, well-dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested official business. Mary, Alexander said formally, though his eyes burned with an intensity that made her pulse race. May I present Mr. Whitfield, my solicitor? He has some information that might interest you. Mr. Whitfield opened his portfolio with the precise movements of a man who had spent decades handling the delicate affairs of the wealthy and powerful. Miss Pemberton, he began in the dry tones of legal precision, it seems Lord Hartley has been quite busy over the past few years. Did you know he owes nearly £20,000 to various creditors across London? Mary shook her head, confused by this unexpected turn. It appears. The solicitor continued with the satisfaction of a man revealing a particularly clever solution, that he's been using letters and private documents to extort money from several families. Your family was not his only victim, merely his most recent. What are you saying? Alexander stepped forward, his expression grim with righteous anger. I'm saying that Hartley is a professional blackmailer, Mary, and this morning, his creditors, who happened to be friends of mine, called in all his debts simultaneously. Mary stared at him in dawning understanding. You arranged this? I arranged for justice. Hartley is currently on a ship bound for the continent, fleeing his creditors with barely the clothes on his back. He won't be returning to England anytime soon. But the letters, my mother's letters, Mr. Whitfield produced another document from his seemingly bottomless portfolio. Purchased yesterday evening for the sum of £50 and destroyed immediately thereafter. All of them. Mary felt the room spin around her as the implications sank in. How much did this cost you? Less than your worth, Alexander replied simply, his words carrying such sincere conviction that Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. Alexander, I still can't the scandal of my birth. My family's reputation has been managed, he interrupted gently. The announcement of our engagement has been accompanied by several carefully placed stories about your charitable work, your dedication to education, and your grace under difficult circumstances. By this afternoon, half of London will be calling you a romantic heroine. Mary looked up at him through her tears, this remarkable man who had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk everything for someone like me? Alexander moved toward her then, closing the distance between them with the determined stride of a man who had finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. Because I love you, he said simply. Because you make me want to be the man I was meant to be, not just the Duke I was born to be. Because a life without you isn't a life worth living. He knelt then, there in her modest parlor with its mended furniture and faded wallpaper, and took her hands in his. Mary Pemberton, he said, his voice rough with emotion, will you marry me? Not because of duty or convenience or social expectation, but because you love me too? Mary looked down at this powerful man kneeling before her, this Duke who had chosen love over logic, hope over convention, and her Mary Pemberton, the woman with torn shoes and impossible dreams over all the polished perfection money could buy. Yes, she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Alexander. I'll marry you. As he pulled her into his arms, spinning her around the tiny parlor with pure joy, Mary thought of her mother's journal still hidden in her trunk. Someday she would tell Alexander about those pages, about the true story of her mother's sacrifice and Hartley's cruelty. But today was for new beginnings, for love triumphant, for the kind of happy ending she'd stopped believing in but had never quite stopped hoping for. Today was for saying yes to the Duke who had chosen the lady with the torn shoes and offered her a kingdom built on love, respect, and the revolutionary idea that worth comes from character, not circumstances. 3 weeks after Alexander's dramatic proposal, all of London held its breath as the most unexpected wedding of the century approached. St. George's Chapel in Mayfair had never seen such a gathering. Dear listeners, peers and paupers sat side by side in the unprecedented mixing of classes that had the gossip columnists scribbling furiously in their notebooks. In the front pew, little Anne from the charity school sat next to the Marchioness of Aldridge, both wearing their finest clothes and equally wide smiles of anticipation. Mary stood before her mirror in the bridal chamber, scarcely recognizing the radiant woman who gazed back at her. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, with pearls sewn into intricate patterns across the bodice like captured moonbeams. Alexander had insisted she design it herself, saying that his Duchess should wear exactly what made her feel beautiful. You look like a princess from the finest fairy tale, Mrs. Whitmore whispered, adjusting Mary's veil with trembling fingers that spoke of joy rather than sorrow. I feel like I'm dreaming, Mary replied softly, her voice filled with wonder. What if I wake up and find myself back in that tiny parlor, teaching children with broken slates and impossible dreams? Then you'll know you lived the most beautiful dream imaginable, said a familiar voice from the doorway. Mary turned to see Alexander's sister, Lady Catherine Blackwood, entering with a small velvet box that seemed to glow with inner light. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with the same dark eyes as her brother and a reputation for speaking her mind without fear of consequences. From Alexander, Catherine said, opening the box to reveal a tiara that made Mary gasp with its breathtaking beauty. It was a delicate creation of diamonds and sapphires, designed to look like intertwined roses and thorns. Beauty and strength combined in perfect harmony. I can't. It's too magnificent. Nonsense, Catherine replied firmly, placing the tiara on Mary's golden hair with the reverence due to a sacred ceremony. Alexander chose you not despite your humble origins, but because of the strength they gave you. You've earned every diamond in this tiara through your courage, your kindness, and your refusal to be defeated by circumstances beyond your control. As Mary looked at herself crowned with centuries of Blackwood history, she felt the last of her doubts melt away like morning frost in sunlight. She wasn't just marrying a duke, she was joining a family, inheriting a legacy and accepting the responsibility to make that legacy better. The ceremony itself was unlike any London had ever witnessed, dear listeners. Instead of the traditional cold formality that marked aristocratic weddings, it sparkled with genuine joy and love that seemed to transform everyone present. When Alexander saw Mary walking down the aisle, his composure cracked entirely, tears of pure happiness slipping down his cheeks as he mouthed "beautiful" for all to see. Caring nothing for ducal dignity in the face of such overwhelming love, the vows they exchanged were personal, written by themselves rather than copied from dusty tradition. "Mary!" Alexander's voice rang clear through the chapel, carrying to every corner where hearts waited to hear his promise. "I vow to love not just your beauty, but your fierce intelligence. Not just your gentleness, but your warrior's heart. I promise to stand beside you as you change the world, one child, one school, one injustice at a time." Mary's voice was equally strong, carrying the conviction of a woman who had found her true home. "Alexander, I promise to love not just your title, but the man who kneels in schoolrooms to praise children's handwriting. I promise to challenge you, support you, and remind you every day that true nobility comes from the choices we make, not the circumstances we're born into." When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was so passionate that several elderly ladies fanned themselves vigorously, while the younger ones sighed with romantic yearning. But it was what happened after the ceremony that London would remember forever, dear listeners, because that's when the past came calling one final time. The wedding breakfast at Ravenshollow House was in full swing, a glittering celebration that brought together dukes and dustmen, marchionesses and milkmaids when an unexpected guest arrived at the grand entrance. The butler announced him with obvious discomfort. "Lord Reginald Hartley, your grace." The magnificent ballroom fell silent as if a spell had been cast over the entire gathering. Hartley stood in the doorway, no longer the polished gentleman, but a man clearly at the end of his rope. His clothes were wrinkled, his face haggard, and his eyes held the wild look of someone with nothing left to lose. "How dare you?" Alexander began, rising from the head table with dangerous intent. "I've come to make amends," Hartley interrupted, his voice carrying across the silent room with desperate urgency. "To tell the truth about Lady Catherine Pemberton. The whole truth this time." Mary felt Alexander's hand tighten on hers, but before either of them could respond, Hartley stumbled forward, reaching into his coat. "I've been running for weeks," he continued, his voice breaking with exhaustion and what might have been genuine remorse, hiding from creditors, living like a criminal in the shadows. And all for what? For secrets that weren't even mine to keep. He withdrew Mary's mother's journal, the one Mrs. Whitmore had shown her weeks ago, holding it up for all to see. "This tells the real story," Hartley said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Lady Catherine wasn't a willing participant in her own destruction. She was a grieving widow, vulnerable and lost, and God forgive me, I exploited that vulnerability for my own twisted gain." The room buzzed with whispers, but Hartley pressed on with the determination of a man seeking redemption. "She came to me for comfort after her husband's death, just friendship, nothing more. but I saw opportunity where I should have offered support. I encouraged her gambling, provided her with credit she couldn't afford. And when she tried to stop, I threatened to ruin her daughter's prospects unless she continued. Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. But these were different tears of vindication, of her mother's memory finally being restored. Everything she did, Hartley continued, his voice now steady with conviction. Every compromise she made, every desperate choice, it was all to protect Mary. She sacrificed herself piece by piece to ensure her daughter would have a chance at happiness. Why are you telling us this now? Alexander demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Hartley looked directly at Mary, and for the first time, she saw genuine remorse in his eyes rather than calculating malice. Because 3 days ago, I met a young woman in Dover, a girl fleeing an arranged marriage, with nothing but the clothes on her back and hope in her heart. She reminded me of Catherine when I first met her, lost, frightened, vulnerable. His voice cracked with emotion. And I realized that I could either help her or become the monster who destroyed her, just as I destroyed Catherine. He placed the journal on the nearest table with the reverence due to a sacred relic. I helped the girl find safe passage to Ireland instead of taking advantage of her desperation. And I decided that perhaps it was time to face the consequences of my choices. To tell the truth, even if it destroys me completely. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft sound of Mary's tears falling onto her wedding gown. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to dispensing justice. Hartley, you're correct about one thing. It is indeed time to face consequences. But perhaps redemption is still possible for a man willing to tell the truth and make amends. Mary stood then, her wedding gown rustling in the absolute stillness. Every eye in the room fixed on her as she walked toward the man who had caused her family so much pain. Lord Hartley, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom. My mother wrote in her journal that anger was a poison she couldn't afford to drink. She wrote that she forgave you, even as you were destroying her. If she could find it in her heart to forgive you, then perhaps I can too. She paused, her voice growing stronger with each word, drawing on the strength her mother had given her through sacrifice. But forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. You will make public restitution, not just to my family, but to every family you've wronged. You will use whatever influence you have left to undo the damage you've caused. Hartley nodded through his tears, the first honest tears he'd shed in years. Yes, I will do whatever it takes. And Mary continued, her voice ringing with the authority of a woman who had found her power. You will establish a fund for women in desperate circumstances, so that no widow ever again feels forced to compromise her principles to survive. So that no mother ever again has to sacrifice her soul to protect her children. I have no money left, Hartley began. Then you'll work to earn it, Alexander interjected firmly, rising to stand beside his wife. You'll work honestly, perhaps for the first time in your life, to repair what you've broken. As Hartley was led away by the magistrate who had been quietly summoned, the wedding guests erupted in conversation and applause. But Mary barely heard them. She was thinking of her mother, of the burden of shame she carried for so long, now finally lifted from her shoulders like chains falling away. Are you all right? Alexander asked softly, drawing her into his arms in front of all assembled London society. I'm free, Mary whispered against his chest, her voice filled with wonder. Finally, completely free. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had come to celebrate their love, Mary Pemberton Blackwood knew with absolute certainty that some fairy tales do come true not through magic, but through the courage to fight for what's right and the strength to forgive what's past. 5 years later, the Duchess of Ravenshollow stood before the newest Ravenshollow Educational Foundation School, watching as the cornerstone was laid for what would be the 100th institution in their network. Around her, a crowd had gathered that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. Dukes and dustmen, marchionesses and milkmaids, all united in celebration of education and opportunity. "Speech! Speech!" called voices from the crowd, and Mary smiled, no longer the shy, uncertain woman who had once taught children in a cramped Whitechapel schoolhouse. 5 years as a duchess had taught her to command a room, to speak with authority, to lead with both passion and wisdom. "Friends," she began, her voice carrying easily over the assembled multitude. "When I first began teaching children that society had forgotten, I never imagined that we would one day celebrate 100 schools serving over 50,000 students across England and beyond." The crowd cheered with genuine enthusiasm. "But the true measure of our success is not in numbers," Mary continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "It's in the young woman who will become England's first female doctor because she learned to read in one of our schools. It's in the young man who will revolutionize engineering because we taught him that his birth in a workhouse did not limit his potential." Her eyes found Alexander in the crowd, her heart still skipping a beat at the sight of him after all these years of marriage. "It's in the proof we provide every day that love, whether for a person or a principle, can indeed change the world." After the ceremony, as they rode home through the London streets in their carriage, Alexander took Mary's hand in his with the same tenderness he'd shown on their wedding day. "Any regrets, Your Grace?" he asked, using the formal address that had become a private joke between them. "Only one," Mary replied with mock seriousness. Alexander's eyebrows rose in concern. "What's that?" Mary's expression melted into the mischievous smile he'd fallen in love with years ago. "That I didn't say yes to your proposal even sooner." Alexander laughed, the rich sound filling their carriage with joy. "Well then, we'll simply have to make up for lost time." "Speaking of time," Mary said softly, her hand moving to rest on her gently rounded stomach, "there is something I need to tell you." Something in her tone made Alexander's laughter fade into intense attention. "What is it?" Mary placed his hand over hers, over the small life growing within her. "It seems our legacy will include more than just schools, my dear Duke." Alexander's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, wonder, joy, before settling on pure, radiant happiness. "A baby," he whispered with the awe of a man receiving the greatest gift imaginable. "Our baby," Mary confirmed, tears of joy sparkling in her eyes. "A little duke or duchess who will grow up knowing that worth comes from character, not birthright." As Alexander spun her around in their carriage, both of them laughing with pure delight, Mary reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. She had started as a woman society had discarded, teaching forgotten children in a cramped schoolhouse. She had become a duchess, a reformer, a woman whose love story had changed not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of children across England and beyond. And now she would become a mother, raising a child who would inherit not just wealth and title, but the knowledge that true nobility comes from service to others. "I love you, Mary Blackwood," Alexander whispered, using her married name with the same reverence other men reserved for prayer. "And I love you, Alexander Blackwood," she replied, her voice filled with the certainty that comes from a love tested by adversity and proven true. "My Duke, my husband, my heart." From the private papers of Lady Catherine Blackwood, found in the Ravenshollow archived Dearest Diary, today marks a milestone I never dared dream possible. I graduated from Cambridge University with first-class honors in mathematics, the fifth woman ever to achieve such distinction, and the first to do so while maintaining that education is a right, not a privilege. Papa cried during the ceremony, though he tried to hide it behind his handkerchief. Mama simply glowed with pride, as if my achievement were the most natural thing in the world. Which, I suppose, in their eyes it was. People often ask me what it's like to be the daughter of the famous Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow. They expect tales of privilege and luxury, and while those certainly exist, they miss the true gift my parents gave me. They gave me the absolute certainty that I could become anything I chose to be. Mama's schools now operate in 23 countries across 3 continents. Papa's political reforms have been adopted throughout Europe and beyond. Together, they've proven that love, real, transformative love, can indeed change the world. But their greatest achievement isn't recorded in the history books or commemorated in marble statues. It's in the hundreds of thousands of children who grew up believing in their own worth, because my parents believed in theirs first. I am one of those children. And someday, God willing, I will pass that gift on to my own children. Because the best legacies I've learned aren't built of stone and mortar. They're built of hope and love and the courage to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. With all my love and gratitude, Catherine Blackwood P.S. Young Lord Pemberton proposed yesterday evening beneath the very oak tree where Papa first told Mama he loved her. I said yes, of course. Mama says that love finds a way to complete the circle, and perhaps she's right. After all, the greatest love stories are never really finished. They simply inspire new chapters in the lives they touch. And so ends the tale of Mary Pemberton and Alexander Blackwood. Dear listeners, the Duke, who chose the lady with the torn shoes and discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the humblest packages. Their story reminds us that true love doesn't ask us to change who we are. It asks us to become who we're meant to be. It doesn't require perfection, it requires courage. And it doesn't promise an easy path, it promises a worthwhile one. In a world that often values appearance over substance, wealth over worth, and convenience over commitment, their love stands as a beacon of hope. It proves that the heart recognizes truths that society cannot teach, and that sometimes the most scandalous thing you can do is follow your heart with absolute faith in its wisdom. Mary and Alexander's love changed not just their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of thousands. It challenged unjust systems, broke down barriers that had stood for centuries, and proved that love, real, transformative love, is indeed the most powerful force in the universe. Their legacy lives on in every child who learns to read in a Ravenshollow school, in every woman who refuses to accept limitations others place upon her, in every person who chooses love over fear, hope over despair, courage over convention. May we all have the bravery to love as deeply, choose as courageously, and dream as boldly as the Duke who chose the lady with the torn shoes and found in her everything he never knew he needed. Because in the end, love always wins, always. The greatest love stories never truly end, they simply become the foundation upon which new love stories are built, generation after generation, creating a legacy of hope that echoes through eternity. And that, dear listeners, is the most beautiful truth of all. Oh my goodness, did this epic Regency romance completely capture your heart and soul? If Mary and Alexander's passionate love story made you believe in fairy tale endings all over again, we absolutely need your help to spread this magical tale across the world. Smash that subscribe button right now if you're ready to join our royal court of hopeless romantics. We've got entire libraries full of swoony dukes, fierce heroines, and love stories that will make your heart race faster than a midnight carriage chase through the cobblestone streets of London. Give this video the biggest thumbs up if you felt those butterflies during their first waltz. If you cheered when Alexander defended Mary against all of society. If you cried happy tears at their wedding. Or if you got chills when Hartley finally confessed the truth. Your likes help other romance lovers discover these incredible stories. Drop a comment below and tell us your absolute favorite moment. Was it when Alexander first saw Mary teaching those precious children? When he announced their engagement in the scandal sheets without asking? That swoon-worthy proposal that had us all clutching our hearts? Or the moment when love finally conquered all the obstacles society threw at them? Share this tale with every romance-loving soul in your life. Tag your best friend who believes true love conquers all, your sister who devours historical romance like chocolate, your book club that can't get enough of dashing dukes and happily ever afters. Everyone deserves a love story as epic and inspiring as Mary and Alexander's. And if you're completely obsessed with Regency romance and can't get enough of balls, ball gowns, scandals that rock the ton, and love that defies all logic, smash that notification bell. We've got more passionate love stories coming that will transport you straight to the most elegant ballrooms of Mayfair and the most romantic gardens of England. Remember, beautiful dreamers, somewhere out there is someone ready to choose you, exactly as you are. Torn shoes, difficult circumstances, and all. Keep believing in the transformative power of love, because the greatest romances always begin when we have the courage to believe we deserve our own happily ever after. Until our next romantic adventure together, keep your hearts open, your dreams alive, and your dancing slippers ready for love.